prior to the First World War, it was typical for infantry rifles to be longer than 50 inches in length. The French, the British, the Russians, the Germans, the Americans, all these nations feel that rifles are longer than 50 inches in length. And this is because, at the time, military doctrine called for rifles to be lengthy and to have large bayonets in order to not only boost troop morale, but to also efficiently engage with the enemy. You see, at the time, cavalry still dominated the battlefield, and it enhanced a soldier's capability to fight cavalry when they were able to have a long rifle with a long bayonet, and they were able to reach out and poke the guy. And as demonstrated by warfare in the 19th century, bayonet fighting was pretty typical of armies engaging each other. Because at the time, when rifles were primarily black powder, that is, soldiers would shoot each other at a distance, and they would engage each other with the bayonet. However, this would all change with the outbreak of the First World War. As the First World War dragged on, and soldiers became mired in the horror of trench warfare, it became apparent that having a longer rifle isn't necessarily to the benefit of the soldier. In that case, length didn't matter. So it was during that conflict that the Germans and the British and other nations start fielding shorter carbines, which were typically given to cavalrymen or artillerymen, soldiers who weren't necessarily at the front line. These rifles were given to the infantrymen at the front line, and they were able to wield them to great use. You see, in the narrow confines of the trenches, a long rifle was much harder to maneuver, it was cumbersome, and when it came time to stab someone in close quarters combat, it was quite difficult when they're only a few feet away from you and they were able to get within a certain space and block your bayonet from being used. And in the trenches, it would be impossible to really move with the bayonet and effectively use it. So because of that, some of the lessons learned in the First World War resulted in, during the interwar period, rifles being shortened, and shortened rifles being the primary weapon used in the Second World War. For instance, the Germans adopted the Kar 98K, which was a shortened version of their Gewehr 98 rifle from the First World War, and it only measured about 43 inches. The United States fielded the M1 Garand, which was only about 43.5 inches. And the Italians, which are considered one of the weakest players of the Axis nations during the Second World War, fielded the M38 Carbine, which was fielded to great use and was only about 40 inches in length. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because I want to do a case study of the Russian carbine at the time. Now, what perplexes me is that while all these majority Western nations start switching over to shorter length rifles, the Russians didn't quite do that. You see, the Russians were primarily using this rifle as their primary arm for infantry soldiers. This is the M9130. It was the original rifle was designed in 1891, and in 1930 they decided to update it by shortening the barrel only about 2 inches. This rifle overall is about 51 inches in length. And with the bayonet attached, here's the bayonet. It's a big old socket bayonet. It's about 68 inches in length. It is just a massive, cumbersome rifle compared to what the other nations were wielding at the time. And the Russians at the time believed that having a bayonet like this helped enhance the morale of the Russian soldiers. They would feel more confident engaging the enemy at a closer distance. And the M9130, it was already quite, I wouldn't say crude, but it wasn't as good as some of the other weapons that the other nations of the Second World War were using. The design was pretty much outdated by then. The bolt isn't the best design. It's not the smoothest bolt out there. And as quality control would drop during the Second World War as the Russians had their backs against the wall, these rifles became even more crude and obsolete compared with some of the other rifles. But what I think is one of the defining factors which made these rifles obsolete was just their length. It just feels very backwards and behind compared to the Kar 98 and the M1 Garand and some of these other rifles. So that leads me to my next point. Let me bring out the next rifle. Here is the M38 Carbine. Now, it's indeed quite a bit shorter than that other one. It's much more handier, it's much more lighter, and this rifle only has a length of about 39 inches. So this rifle, in terms of its length, is on par with the Kar 98K, the M1 Garand, and the Carcano in terms of its length. However, the Russians never fielded this one to great use. Over 37 million Mosins were made, but only a few of these were made. These were typically designated for artillerymen, for cavalrymen, and for any reserve backline troops that didn't really need a full-length rifle, as it was cumbersome. But despite the full-length rifle being cumbersome, the infantry were still stuck with it. Now, don't get me wrong. As mediocre the M91 30 is compared to the German Kar 98K or the M1 Garand, I will have to give the Russians credit because they were able to field it to their own success, and the rifle was what they were able to produce at the time, and they produced millions of them. And they were able to use it, and they were able to defeat the Third Reich. So, despite it being not the best rifle, it wouldn't be my first choice, it still was an effective weapon in the hands of the Red Army. So, the M38 saw use, and it became apparent that this rifle was excellent for urban combat. So just like the M91 was poor in trench warfare during the First World War, and some of the other long-length rifles were pretty bad in terms of engaging the enemy in close quarters combat, it became apparent in battles such as Leningrad and Stalingrad, where Germans and Russian soldiers were fighting each other in close quarters, and it became hard to maneuver the M9130 with the bayonet in amongst the mounds of rubble and all the debris, and it was just a headache. It was just a mess. But the M9138, the reason it's called M9138 is because this rifle was implemented in 1938, was a wonderful weapon to have in that kind of environment. The 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge was quite potent, and with it being so short, it was just so maneuverable, and it was used effectively. It was used effectively in Leningrad, in Stalingrad, and even in the Battle of Berlin. But one of the downsides of having a rifle like this specifically the M38, was that there was no bayonet. It didn't come with a bayonet because when this rifle was initially designed for the artillerymen and cavalrymen, they didn't need a bayonet because they weren't expected to be engaging in bayonet fighting. Thus, there's no way to mount a bayonet. If I were to grab the M9130 bayonet, it doesn't fit on there. There's no way to do that. There's no way to attach it. So in 1944, the M44 Mosin was fielded in greater use. And what that is typically about the length of the M9130, but with a folding bayonet that's attached to the rifle right here. In fact, this rifle is a Ukrainian refurb that was done sometime post-war, I believe sometime in the 60s or 70s. And the stock on this actually has the cutout for that folding bayonet. Now, most of the rifles that were refurbished after the war have all their own neat little quirks and such, but this rifle was made in 1943 by the Ijevsk factory, and 1943 was a pretty typical year for these to be made, and this is indeed a wartime rifle. So let's go ahead and compare the quality of this rifle and some of the other close-up details of this rifle with the M9130. Alright, so here's a look at the M9130, which was the primary infantry rifle for the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Now, this is a typical example of a refurbished rifle. This was refurbished sometime in the post-war period, and this rifle was actually stored in the Ukraine and came over here to the United States sometime in 2013 or 2014. And so this is one of the last later imports. Now, this example was made by the Tula Arms Factory, and this was made in 1927. So there's a look at the receiver markings. This was made in 1927, and you can see the hammer and sickle in great detail right there. And unfortunately, as you can see right here, this does have the typical later period import marks. Now, they are quite ugly as opposed to the earlier markings, which were rather discreet, but it is what it is. And this rifle has a hexagon-shaped receiver. These are much nicer than some of the later examples. Just the quality and, I guess you could say, craftsmanship that went into this was superior to the more hastily, crudely made rifles of the later period. So, to operate the rifle, you open this bolt right here, and there's the magazine well. This is a 5-round fixed magazine, and it holds 5 rounds of 7.62 by 54 rimmed. It's quite a beefy and potent cartridge. And overall, it's not the best rifle of the Second World War. There's a nice stock cartouche right there. It's not the best rifle of the Second World War. It certainly isn't what I would choose if I had to use a specific rifle. But I will say the Soviets did use it to their advantage. They had what they had and they used it, and it worked. They were able to essentially destroy the Third Reich, and for that reason, I wouldn't say it's not necessarily the worst rifle of the war, but it certainly isn't the best, but it got the job done. And let's see what this rifle looks like in action. Alright, so this is the typical arm of the Soviet infantrymen in the Second World War. This is the M9130 Mosin they got, or Mosin's rifle as the Russians know it as. And this shoots the very beefy, very potent 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge. So my stripper clips don't work very well. I found them to be a little finicky, but single loading it works just fine. This is a hex receiver made in 1927, so it's a nice quality rifle as opposed to some of the later production rifles from the 1930s and especially the Second World War. So, and as typical Red Army fashion, have the fixed bayonet. So let's give this a try. Very nice, very smooth action, very potent round, I'd say. And this was out at 50 yards. Find it quite doable, but overall pretty respectable arm. Not the best, that's not my first choice for what I'd carry in the Second World War, but it did the job. Soviets had what they had. They were able to mass produce this in the millions, so it was good for that kind of thing. So now that we've seen what the M9130 looks like up close and how it operates, let's take a gander at the M9138. So this rifle is a typical 1943 Izhevsk example, as those were the most common. Up here, you can kind of see the markings. This was indeed a rifle manufactured in 1943. There we go, we got it to focus. You can see the arsenal marking of the arrow in the triangle, which designates this as a Izevsk example. And you can see the remnants of a hammer and sickle right there. And of course, you can see the rough machining marks and the crude-looking round receiver. It just doesn't look as nice as the other rifle. And one key difference between this and the full-length rifle is the sights. The distance that Soviet soldiers with the M38 were expected to engage the enemy with were much shorter, and thus the sights weren't as long. And with the M9130, the sights are much longer, as it's a longer rifle, and it was expected of you to be able to reach longer distances with this rifle. Another key difference is with the slots for the sling. The slots for the sling in the M9138, right here, it looks crude. I mean, it's just a hole with a metal separator in there. But with the M9130, it is a slot with actual screws, and it just looks much nicer. And the operating mechanism on the M9138 is pretty much just the same as the M9130. In fact, it's exactly the same. This is still a bolt action, and it's still chambered in 7.62 by 54 rimmed, and those 5 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridges will fit in this fixed magazine right here. And of course, this is a stripper clip fed rifle. Overall, it's a nice example of what an M9138 is, and over 2.5 million of these rifles were made. 50,000 of these were made in Tula, which makes those a little more desirable, as it's much more rare. But the M9138s were typically made in Izevsk, like this example. So now that we've seen what this rifle looks like up close, let's see how it operates and how it shoots. Let's give it a try. And this one's going to kick like a mule. See a little bit of that bolt at the end, but very stout. It feels very stout shooting out of this one, and I slightly prefer this one over the M9130 just a little bit. I find this one a little more comfortable to shoot, apart from the stout recoil. Feed this with a stripper clip. These Russian ones can be a little finicky sometimes. There we have it. So now that we've compared and shot both rifles, I wanted to talk about my own personal experience behind the trigger of these two. So let's start off with the M9130. Overall, both these rifles were a pleasure to shoot, as any firearm is. but they differ in their own ways. So one thing to preface is that with the Mosin action, it's almost a two-motion gesture just to unlock the bolt. And that's just because of the way the bolt is designed. It's kind of a early smokeless powder design, but I mean, this rifle works fine enough. This is, again, a 1927 year made rifle, and it's just the finish on this is nice. The craftsmanship is quite good as well, and I didn't have any problems operating it. I've never had a problem with rim lock. It's just a joy to shoot this rifle, and it's cheap. It was cheaper before the Russian import ban on ammo and such, but still a comparatively cheap rifle to shoot. I do feel that with the socket bayonet attached, this rifle can get a little heavy operating the action and aiming down the sight, and this is a very heavy, long rifle, which is why this other rifle was designed and implemented for the artillery, the cavalry, and the motor transport and other backline reserve troops. But yeah, it's a fun rifle to shoot, and I can see why the Russians stuck with it. It worked. It certainly did the job. Now, with the M38, this was fun to shoot. In the footage, I'm sure you saw the fireball the short barrel produced. And I've always had a little bit of a problem with this example. Apart from the two-gesture motion to unlock the bolt, sometimes the bolt gets stuck. It's very sticky sometimes. So after I will shoot a cartridge, use a cartridge, it'll be really difficult to unlock the bolt. And sometimes I have to kind of force it open through some really, not abusive, but through some really rough ways. And I cleaned out the bolt some more. I've heard some issues were because of cosmoline, or when these bolts were refurbished post-war, they weren't fitted right. But after I disassembled, oiled, lubricated, and cleaned my bolt a little bit more, it became less of an issue. It still occurs occasionally, but it's certainly much less of an issue than it was before. This rifle was much more of a joy to hold up, aim repeatedly, operate the action. It was just much more of a pleasure to shoot. It was more fun to shoot too, in my opinion. It's the same hooded front sight, so it's pretty easy to acquire a target with this. And overall, I do think it's a shame that the Russians didn't use this rifle much more than they did. Yeah, 2 million were made, but compared to the 37 million of these that were made, I do think that the Soviet Union would have benefited from having more of these rifles. They would have been, I mean, I wouldn't say quite as equal as their contemporaries. I mean, this doesn't compare with a Mauser 98 action or a Lee Enfield or the M1 Garand. It doesn't really compete with that. But I do think that the Soviets could have been a little bit closer had they adopted this rifle for more prolific use rather than the M9130. But in 1943, they started introducing the folding bayonet version, which would be the M44. And that was quite useful. It was a good stopgap until the SKS was introduced and until the AK-47 was introduced. And millions of these two examples were not only imported to the United States at the end of the Cold War, but even at the end of the Spanish Civil War. Many of these were imported to the United States by Franco, and millions of these also were sent abroad to places in Africa, to the Middle East, to Vietnam, China, all those other communist countries that had some kind of connection to the Soviet Union. But overall, in conclusion, I do think that the M9138 could have been much more of a step in the right direction had it been issued in greater numbers to the regular Soviet infantry. It has a lot of things going for it, and I would prefer this over the M9130. But yeah, it's certainly a joy to shoot, and it does a job just fine. And I definitely would have preferred this, the M9130, M9138 over the M9130 in not just regular combat, but when it came to urban combat or just marching and carrying this thing around. I mean, you got to think about it. The Soviet Union, or preferably called the Soviet steamroller during the Second World War, when they marched all the way from the Soviet Union to Berlin, a lot of soldiers marched on foot. I believe the vast majority of them traveled on foot. And I just can't imagine having to sling this thing around with a bayonet fixed sometimes for hours a day. I'm sure it wasn't fun. But I would have much rather preferred this handy little carbine, and that's certainly why it was implemented for the cavalry and for the artillery and those other reserve units. But thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a pleasure to really make this video, and I hope to do more production in the future. And if you could please like and share and subscribe, it would really help the channel. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.